guys, and welcome to Ancestral Recall. I'm your host, Eli Kaplan. This is a web series that examines over 2 decades of the history of Magic the Gathering, set by set. We cover all the relevant, historically important, and cool cards of the past, putting the game into context throughout the years and possibly giving you some cool cards for EDH, Cube, and casual formats. We're getting closer and closer to the big 50th episode, which is going to be a very special one, but I digress. Last time we were looking at 1995's Ice Age, looking at the white and blue cards as well as the story and a bit of the background. Now let's look at the rest of the cards, starting off with black. Abyssal Spectre is a fixed Hypnotic Spectre, just like a Nerf sword is a fixed sword, taking away the random discard ability and making it so that the player discarding chooses, tacking on 1 additional mana and giving it 1 token point of toughness and more, made this card a lot less formidable than its predecessor. But at least Abyssal Spectre was fair. Abyssal Spectre saw print in a few core sets and never got played. Brine Shaman highlights Ice Age's modest emphasis on allied colors, although to be honest, most of the emphasis is on blue and black together. Now you can sacrifice the Shaman or another creature to give something +2/+2, or you can pay 1 UU and sacrifice a creature to counter another creature spell, effectively removing its soul. Getting a 2-for-1 with this card is extremely difficult, but at least Brine Shaman is versatile. Dance of the Dead has some of the sweetest art in the set. Fun fact, the artist of this card is colorblind. Unlike the original Reanimate Dead, this aura gave its target +1/+1, although it also required a mana payment to untap the creature, and brought the creature in tapped, so it couldn't block. But still, Dance of the Dead, cool art, cool name. Is it worth trying out instead of Animate Dead? Yeah, sure. Dark Banishing costs 1 more mana than its predecessor, Terror, but overcomes the artifact creature restriction. Now, this is a fairly priced removal spell, and Dark Banishing saw repeated reprints in future blocks, like for example, Mirage. Wizards saw this tweak as a success, and I'd argue, rightly so. Here's one of my favorite cards of the set, Demonic Consultation, an instant speed demonic tutor for half the mana? But oh, there was a price. There are many stories of players losing horribly to their own consultation, since casting the spell requires the player to take a 6-card chunk off the top of their library, sight unseen, then continue to exile cards until you hit the named card. The risk is that all the copies of the card you wanted might be in those top 6 cards, so you might end up just dying by milling yourself. Consultation saw a lot of play in Necropotence decks, however. If you are looking for a wretched black enchantment to befoul your horror-themed deck, Hecatomb fits the bill. Playing this enchantment requires you to sacrifice 4 creatures, or you end up sacrificing the enchantment itself. That's painful. But at that point, you can tap a swamp to deal 1 point of damage to target creature or player. That feels very red, but the requirement to sacrifice 4 guys, ooh, that's steep and black. Note that this templating came with the reprint in 6th edition. The original's wording was a headache. Now, I was curious as to the source of Hecatomb's name, and the term is a Greek word referring to a great public sacrifice of 100 cattle or more. Also, Wizards released a card game named Hecatomb in 2005, with players representing ancient, chthonic, cosmic horrors, fighting for the right to unleash Armageddon on Earth. Now, the cards in this game were plastic, not paper, and had 5 sides, of course pentagram shape. Wacky stuff, but this game got discontinued a mere year after release. It just didn't take off. Okay, now it's time to talk about one of Magic's most infamous artistic mistakes, the Hyalopterous Lemur. This card was supposed to be a winged soul of the evil dead that could take to the skies at a cost. The artists didn't do their research and turned in a hideous-looking, squirrel-looking beast, a lemur. Now, here's what the designers wanted. Lemurs are monsters from, I believe, 1st edition D&D's Unearthed Arcana. But we got these. Later on, in Time Spiral, the intended art for this card got made with viscid lemurs, but the person in the flavor text was just as confused as the original's artist. Hyalopterous Lemur was actually a pretty decent card at the time. A 5-drop for a 3/3 that could take in the air, or, it can swing on the ground at 4/3. not the worst thing in the world. Infernal Darkness. Such an incredibly cool name. The actual text of the enchantment? The cumulative upkeep of both life and mana is harsh, but making all lands produce black instead of their regular type of mana is also pretty mean-spirited, and it also can ruin other people's upkeep costs. Now, this is a spell that really does nothing and makes everyone else do nothing, so it is both offensive in multiplayer games and fails to really develop your board. But it has a pretty cool name. Knight of Stromgald, like Order of the White Shield, is a simple reprint of Fallen Empire's Order of the Ebon Hand, just with new names. And yes, that meant that you could play 8 Pump Knights in a mono black deck. These Pump Knights were extremely popular in cheap aggressive decks at the time, and cheap aggressive decks liked a card which we'll talk about in just a few seconds. If you like the idea of a cantrip aura, Kravickian Fetish is right up your alley. It's expensive, and if the target it's supposed to enchant dies, you're really out. And yeah, you get the card the turn after you play it, but this kind of incremental advantage may appeal to many in budget cubes. Just look at Mind Warp. It's a creepy, unsettling looking card, and yes, this was an attempt to fix ABU's Mind Twist. It could selectively take the best card from opponents' hands, or the best cards, but the spell's prohibitive mana costs effectively made it useless. Here we go, Necropotence. This is the most famous Ice Age card, providing a brutally effective draw engine, one of Magic's first real draw engines. Most players took several months to warm up to this draw engine, which, yeah, it requires a steep cost. You're giving up your regular draw, but as players recognize the potential amounts of huge numbers of cards every turn, this turned into an engine that dominated both Standard and Extended when that format became popular. Necropotence also comboed extremely well with Illusions of Grandeur in the set. I mean, yeah, you get to draw 20 more cards when you play it. Woo, good stuff. Ken Nagel, lover of fatties, is one of R&D's top designers, and his favorite card is Norrit from Ice Age. In fact, Nagel used Norrit as his pen name for countless articles for Star City before working for Wizards. Norrit is a Nettling Imp which has the additional ability to untap a blue creature. It's flavorful, sure, I like it. Here's another brutal black spell, Pox, one of Ice Age's most powerful spells, and yeah, it's symmetrical. It forces all players to sacrifice a third of their creatures, a third of their life, a third of their hand, and most painfully, a third of their lands. Aggressive black decks ran this in conjunction with Necropotence to reload and Pump Knights for a hellish beatdown, creating the most popular Standard archetype for most of 95 and 96. Withering Wisps is a discounted version of Pestilence. Its activation is limited by the number of snow swamps you control. Casual fans who don't mind paying a bit more for those snow-covered lands might really enjoy this. As for me, not my cup of tea. You can't really put this in cubes unless you really want to have all your basic lands be snow-covered. Anarchy. Ow, man. This is just a brutal color hoser. Really? Destroying all white permanents? This is Red's first answer to Circle of Protection Red, but man, it's not even a fair card. Ugh. Glacial Crevice is a good reason to play snow-covered mountains. You can sacrifice a snow-covered mountain to Fog repeatedly. What? Fog in red? Now, this is overpowered, but if there's a color that shouldn't be fogging, it's red. Goblin Mutants for 2 RR. This cowardly guy doesn't know his own strength, but red had lots of good burn and was well positioned to get any guys that would block it out of his way. Now, Goblin Mutant isn't nearly as big as Fallen Empire's Org, but it hits on the same themes, and happily the mutant has positive synergy with Goblin tribal cards, so this was an exciting uncommon that many players tried out at the time. If you think you're going to hear me make a Frozen singing reference, think again. Goblin Snowman is overcosted, but the idea of goblins hiding behind a barrier of snow, pelting a snowball at a guy, alright, yeah, that's pretty entertaining. Yokel Helps. Finally, we get an amazing red sweeper. Yokel Helps is a term for a deluge caused by a glacial break, when a wall of ice ends up melting and falling onto a community, destroying it outright. This spell destroys all permanents except for enchantments and planeswalkers. And unlike Earthquake, this even deals with flyers. Yokel Helps became a staple of red control decks for years. Jokelhaupt's inspired Urza Saga's Wildfire, a card that spawned many archetypes, as well as Invasion's Obliterate. Hey, look at this card! Can you find the Carplucent Yeti in the card's art? As nice as the figures in the foreground are, that's not what the card's supposed to represent, so I call this a failure of composition. In fact, that female ranger, she's on some of the boosters! And that's not even the card! Now, this isn't as irritating as Whippoorwill, because, Whippoorwill, that poor child from the dark, was a bird that didn't have flying. But this is still bad! If you love flyers above all other creatures, then don't just help your team, slow down everybody else. Mudslide forces players to pay 2 mana each to untap a non-flyer. In terms of modern color pie, this doesn't work. But it's still an interesting spell, and something that will make your EDH tables and token-loving players groan with despair. I also might add that this is not something people expect out of Red, so yeah, give it a try. Pyroblast and Hydroblast are new versions of Blue and Red Elemental Blast. I like the name change. Pyroclasm. At 1R, this was a huge hit for years, taking down weenie decks at a very cheap cost. This saw tons of reprints in core sets over the years, and is almost too good to reprint in Standard these days. This is the first outing for this spell. Orcish Lumberjack is not just okay. It's a huge mana accelerant, letting you trade a forest for 4 mana overall. This guy was extremely popular back in the day, powering out huge 5-drops or 6-drops on turn 2 or 3. The day in which he works, followed by the entire night in which he sleeps. And no, I'm not going to sing today, I already told you. Elder Druid has a lot of flexibility for green, tapping or untapping a permanent. Now, untapping a permanent is part of the color pie of green, thanks to ABUs Instill Energy and Ley Druid. Tapping a permanent in green? Not so much. But hey, 1995, this is the Wild West of the color pie. Keep in mind, we did recently talk about a blue enchantment that gains you 20 life. If you want to slow down a game of Magic, Freyalise' Winds is a potent application. This forces permanents to wait an additional turn to untap. Lands, creatures, artifacts, everything. This is what I call grief-tastic. Legends introduced a mechanic called Rampage, a combat mechanic that made blocked creatures bigger for each additional creature past the first. Now, there are a few rampaging creatures in Ice Age block, but the card I want to tell you about is Yattlworm, which has negative rampage. For each creature past the first blocking it, the worm gets -2, -1. That's a serious drawback, and yeah, -2, -1 is weird math, but hey, it's a 6/6 for 6, which back in the day was nearly unheard of. Ach, Hans, run! It's the most famous creature of the set! The Lurgoyf grows for each dead creature, making it one of Magic's first multiplayer all-stars. This right here is the blueprint for all other Lurgoyfs to come, from Terravore to Cognivore to Tarmogoyf. As a creature more focused on mechanics than flavor, yet establishing flavor, Lurgoyf's only real peer from this era is Antiquity's Atog. The flavor text is also one of the most recognized in all of Magic. I mean, just the sound. Ach! You want to do it with the Scottish and Hans, or Hans if you really want to, but I believe the of Hans makes it just that much more crisp. The Lurgoyf, yeah, there are some clunky cards in Ice Age, but this one is a keeper. Green does not usually get ritual-type one-shot mana burst effects. That's the province of black with Dark Ritual, or red with Seething Song, or, for example, Orcish Lumberjack. But in green, we do get Tinderwall, an 0/3 body for G that can immediately be traded in for RR. Yes, the color difference is significant. Combine this with Orcish Lumberjack, and Ice Age players were able to power out 6 or 7 drops on turn 2. Jester's Cap was the most expensive card when the set hit the street, commanding upwards of $12 for quite a while after release. Keep in mind that lots of people played control decks at the time, and Jester's Cap was able to take out 3 different win conditions, or answers to your 1-game winning threat. The idea that you could change your opponent's future, shutting down future draws while not doing anything about the current game state, well, yeah, today we consider it weak, it's a bit of a joke, but hey, jokey, that's why we see a Jester on the card. The iconic art is definitely important, and even led to this booster image from Unglued. Somewhat less popular was Jester's Mask, which lets you replace an opponent's hand. This is not particularly fun or interesting, to be honest. There's only one real decision, which is either if they're mana screwed, you give them 7 spells, or if it's late game, you make your opponent's flood. This is definitely unkind. And the art, well, not my cup of tea. I'm not going to explain to you exactly how Ice Cauldron works, because I don't want this video running any longer than it has to, and we'd have to be here for a while. Here's errata on it from Gatherer, just to show you. But in a nutshell, Ice Cauldron lets you put a spell on it, pay mana to cook it up to the level you want, and then you can cast it. The primary function of this spell is to set up a really big X spell, such as Brain Geyser or Fireball. The errata on this card, I just showed it to you. That's extensive. If you want to repel judges, keep this card handy. At the time, there weren't many ways to look at the top of your library or your opponent's library, so Vexing Arcanix was a risky way of dealing damage. Nowadays, Scry and cards that reveal the top of your library are going to work very well with this slightly pricey but fun artifact. Zuran Orb. I hate Zuran Orb. Zuran Orb can just be a life gain card that lets you trade lands for 2 life, which can keep many decks in the game for significantly longer. Or Zuran Orb can be added to Armageddon and Balance decks and just ruin games. This card got restricted in Standard for a bit, which was missing the point because it was mass land destruction that was crushing people's fun, not the orb. But it didn't help. Essentially, Zuran Orb pushed games to last forever. Zuran Orb's existence made so many players put aside aggro decks in favor of control. Now, there aren't many cards out there that make creatures near pointless in the metagame, but Zuran Orb was one of them. Zuran Orb is up there with Skull Clamp and Sensei's Divining Tap as cheap, broken artifacts that made formats miserable. In fact, -1 to the set score, just on the back of this card. With that criticism out of the way, let's turn to something that was successful. There's a very critical cycle that starts in Ice Age and impacted Standard for years, the Pain Lands. Now, these lands hit play untapped, don't have the basic land types, and can tap for colorless mana, or one of an allied pair for 1 damage each time. These got reprinted in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and even 9th edition, since they were fairly balanced and caused interesting decisions. Apocalypse gave us the enemy Pain Lands, which just got a fresh reprint in Magic Origins. There's another cycle of allied lands in Ice Age, but since these only untap after a turn of sitting around, they're just terrible, so I don't even want to talk about them. With that said, of all the innovations in Ice Age, this cycle, the Pain Land cycle, was the best and most efficient fix to the problem of the ABU dual lands for years, and I tip my hat to the designers. Let's take a short break for the top 5 most valuable cards of Ice Age. Why just top 5? Well, because there aren't that many cards worth that much. Final verdict. In short, Ice Age is functional. As a reboot of ABU, this set has cards you can play, attack, block, remove, and tap with. Ice Age does have some innovation thanks to Jester's Cap, Jester's Mask, and Necropotence. Naked Singularity, Ritual of Subdual, and Corruption, as well as Infernal Darkness, made lands work radically differently than players expected. So yeah, that's kinda cool. But what did Ice Age do wrong? For one thing, there were very few cards that really let you exploit having snowlands, with the exception of sacrificing lands to fog and the Pestilence effect. That's tedious and not my idea of fun gameplay. There are a host of cards that keep players from having mana, and that lends itself to unfun games. Prison, as an archetype, shutting your opponents down for doing anything by way of mana, is not an archetype that will get players to play the game, and it will keep people from playing the game. People who have prison opponents curse. Prison is a dead archetype in 2015, and Wizards killed it for a very good reason. Magic is supposed to be fun, and Ice Age, by embracing the prison type, had a ton of cards that promoted mutual misery. Ice Age also had needless complexity, offering lots of hoops to jump through, and very little reward for doing so. Illusionary Wall looks exciting, with 7/4 flying first strike stats, but the actual utility of the card was very limited. Few cumulative upkeep cards that let you advance the board state are worth it. Cards like Scaled Worm got costed assuming that players had access to fast mana, but 8 mana for a 7/6? That's terrible. I mean, the art on Scaled Worm looks amazing. It's one of the art featured on the booster. I have a copy of this card in 3D done by Seishiro Okubo, the famous Japanese 3D alterer. But in terms of design, Scaled Worm is emblematic of a costing problem. It took a while for Wizards R&D to figure out that most people were not playing the game with Moxa and Lotus and Sol Ring in their decks anymore, because the small print run of ABU, combined with a large player base, had made these cards incredible rarities already. There are actions in Ice Age that the set takes to reduce complexity. Instead of having the Ward Cycle from ABU, which gives protection, and no explanation of what protection from a color is, we get the Scarab Cycle, which you can read and immediately understand, but might give a creature +2/+2 and prevent blocking, but doesn't actually do anything to stop various things from being targeted, and it's only a partial help on defense. These cards are mugs being used to bail out the Titanic. Microtext should not be on commons, and the narrowness of so many cards is a problem. Compare one of the strongest uncommon creatures of Ice Age, Soldevi Simulacrum, to one of ABU's most powerful uncommon creatures, Juggernaut. Both cost 4, both are artifact creatures, both have 3 toughness. Juggernaut has 1 quite good ability, walls can't block it. Soldevi Simulacrum has a pretty good ability, colorless fire breathing. But the difference between the two? Well, Juggernaut has to attack, and that's a downside, but it has 3 more power. That's huge. Juggernaut also has the advantage, it doesn't get blocked by walls in an era when walls were plentiful and powerful. Soldevi Simulacrum, look at this card. It can theoretically hit for more, because you can just save it from attacking, but it's going to be limited by mana. And cumulative upkeep limits so many of your options. Now, at the time, the Simulacrum was a reasonably good card. It just wasn't anywhere near as effective as Juggernaut, though, and it required so much more complex decision-making. Should I pay the upkeep? Should I not pay the upkeep? How much mana do I want to commit to this? Does this mean I don't play any spells? Juggernaut involved decision-making like figuring out how to run removal to make sure that it could get through. And in actual gameplay, that's much more satisfying. ABU had a lot of power to throw around, and Ice Age avoided that by taking out as much as possible while allowing for modestly entertaining creature combat. Just modestly entertaining. Ice Age did solve some problems that ABU presented. For example, it created a base form of Magic where flying was special, with 23 flyers to ABU's 19. Now, Eli, I know, 23 flyers, more than ABU's 19, sure, but ABU is only 66% the Ice Age size, so ABU had considerably more flyers in the game in proportion. Flying was too common in ABU to really feel special. Ice Age restored flying to being elite and cool, so we should credit Ice Age for that. Then again, that was part of the trend in sets like The Dark, Fallen Empires, and Homelands, with progressively fewer and fewer flyers. Ice Age was the new alternative core set to 4th edition, which also had somewhat fewer flyers than ABU. Also, as I mentioned last time, players all over the world finally got mass access to black-bordered basic land, something many of them had been craving for months or years. So that sweetened the reception of Ice Age by quite a bit. I have to point out that Wizards' idea of a standalone set went over like a lead balloon. Having restricted cards and multiple formats was one thing. Players wanted balance in tournaments and kitchen tables. But telling people that they shouldn't use any of their old cards to really enjoy the new ones was a bridge too far at this point. Now, compared to other gaming companies such as TSR or White Wolf at the time, WotC was very aggressive in finding ways to communicate with players using the internet and Usenet to get to talk to people. A lot of this was Peter Adkinson's personal mission while he was head of the company. But Ice Age's design was first as a standalone and less as a companion piece to the core set and previous expansions, and that caused it to have a ton of problems. Ice Age as a standalone game was sluggish, incredibly grindy, and had lots of states where nothing happened for turns at a time, and players already had a dynamic, energetic game to compare Ice Age to, the rest of Magic. So this was a case where WotC's communication attempts failed to connect. To their credit, though, Wizards did continue to improve with players thanks to the Pro Tour, Arena League, and other innovations during this time. The problem with the situation was the content of Ice Age, not the idea of communicating with the player community as a whole. The bottom line is this. If you were a new player in July 1995 and came up to me and asked, "Hey Eli, I'm new to this game. What should I get, a box of Ice Age or a box of 4th edition?" I'd have to tell that player to go with 4th edition. Ice Age had only a few tournament staples, overly complex commons and uncommons that didn't do all that much, and its themes didn't quite click. There were so many overly complex, ineffectual junk cards in those boosters, and the gameplay didn't evolve beyond having so many more stalemates. Add in that -1 for my loathing of Zuranorb, and I've got to give Ice Age a final verdict of 3 out of 10, bad. With 383 cards, there have to be cool things in the set. It's definitely more fun than Homelands, but on the whole, it was a poor execution of a block. It took them almost 11 months to go back to the drawing board with alliances. Between Homelands and Ice Age, this was Magic at its lowest point, the closest it had ever been to dying. That is not to say that the game was dying, but the player reception of new versus old was negative. The consensus was that older sets were just plain better than newer ones, and you couldn't get older cards at the time. And the wisdom of the crowd wasn't that wrong. Ice Age created a situation that had to be addressed, and that's why I'm so critical of the set. Thanks for watching. In 2 episodes, we'll be returning with alliances. But next time, it's our 50th milestone episode. Oh yeah? Are you pumped? I am. And what are we looking at for our milestone 50th episode? Well, you're just gonna have to wait to see what the set is next time. It's definitely a major landmark set in history of collectible card games. It's one of Wizards' finest projects. It's seasonally appropriate, and it will chill you to the bone. This is Eli Kaplan, signing off. Good games, and good luck.